begin. Hello and welcome to Philosophy Club. Feel free to get some pizza if you haven't already. So we're going to be having a debate tonight between those who are defending John Searle's view and those who are defending Dan Dennett's view. Now let me lay out the debate just very simply. Raise your hand if you're in my class. Okay, that's a lot of you. Raise your hand if you're not in my class. Okay, all right. So then I'll go very quick to introduce the debate, because most of you are in my class, so most of you are familiar with this. The debate centers around the following question. If a machine acts just like a human, if it can pass the Turing test, if it can converse in fluent English about answering questions as an ordinary English speaker does it understand what it's talking about? For Dan Dennett, the answer is yes. Thought is as thought does. If you act like you understand, you understand. For John Searle, the answer is not necessarily. There are some contraptions we could dream up, some computers, some machines that would simulate human behavior, but wouldn't actually understand what they're talking about. Now, the philosophical term for such creatures is zombies. Philosophers refer to a creature who acts like a human but isn't actually conscious as a zombie. So thus, the debate this evening is about the questions, are zombies real? Okay, that will be debated. Searle's side, over here, with Aaron, Angeline, and Paul, will be arguing that zombies are in fact possible, not necessarily actual, but in principle we could have a creature that walks and talks and acts like a human but doesn't have consciousness. On the other side, we have Nick, Connor, and Dan, and they will be defending Dan Dennett's view, and they will be arguing that zombies are not possible. If you walk like a human, talk like a human, you can interact, you're a human, you understand what you're talking about. Okay? We're going to start with John Searle's side, and they're going to present some of Searle's basic arguments, and then we'll go back and forth, and we'll gradually include the audience as it becomes sort of natural to do so. So please, Paul, do you want to take it away?
All right. Well, I'll start off just by describing a Turing test. A computer passes.
Could you do it a bit louder, please?
Yes. A computer passes a Turing test if it is able to give a series of logical verbal responses to a series of questions. And there would be responses identical to that a human would give. One problem with the Turing test is that a computer can process information without the information having any intentionality. It can be programmed to manipulate words in a way that gives the appearance of understanding without any actual understanding occurring. This understanding is simply an illusion. Searle's example of the Chinese room, which I'm sure many of you have read, exemplifies this problem well. And basically, that argument is that a man who does not understand Chinese, solely in English-speaking, is given a set of rules in English that basically matches various Chinese symbols to other various Chinese symbols. Unbeknownst to the man, these symbols that are being matched are questions and answers. So basically, he's been given the ability to give logical verbal responses in Chinese, a language that he does not know, without the information really being about anything, without him really saying anything, since he doesn't understand what he's saying. Now, one could argue that, well, a code couldn't be developed that would be complex enough that he could memorize it to a point where he would respond as fast as an actual native Chinese speaker would respond. However, what if the man brought a friend into the room with him? Maybe two friends, 3, 4, 10, 100, and so on. Eventually, he would get to a point where himself and his group of friends and the room that he's in as a whole would get to a point where it could give logical responses to questions asked in Chinese by native speakers that would be identical to those of a native speaker, and the speed would be the same. However, clearly there would be no greater degree of understanding, since the room, the man, all his friends, they still, well, in this example at least, they still don't understand any Chinese. So the information has no intentionality. What can be said of the English-speaking man and his group of friends in the room can also also be said of a computer that is programmed to give logical verbal responses to statements and questions. The computer is simply processing information without it being evaluated. Searle says the computer has a syntax with no semantics.
Or defense of Dennett's view?
So, as they've said, this Chinese room supposedly shows us that it's possible to process information without actually understanding what's being said. However, as holding Dennett's view, we are going to assert that there is no greater thing of understanding than the actual processes that go into the processing the inputs and giving the proper outputs. By the time that anyone receives the outputs that we would give, we might as well just be a human.
I mean, one way to think about this is there's a false conception of the mind, which is called the homunculus, which is, you can imagine, when you think about your mental processes, you might imagine something. You'll see an image or a piece of language or thought, or you hear it. And it's almost like you're sitting in a theater and watching the mental processes, and these kind of information processes and images and all this stuff is going on out there. And then in addition to that, there's a viewer, someone who understands it and sees it and looks at it. And then there's a man in the theater watching these images go by. And so that in addition to just processing them and projecting on a blank screen, having the lights on but no one home, there is someone home who can see all of it. And that's one way to think about maybe the distinction between a zombie who can process information and do all this versus someone who, there is someone home, the lights are on and someone's home. But this is commonly known as the homunculus fallacy, where there isn't a guy sitting inside of your head watching all this stuff go on. Because if he's a guy, then what's going on inside his head? Is there another projector seeing all that stuff and there's someone inside of him watching it, and then inside of him there's another thing? No. What really happens is our thought life is just those processes happening. Our thoughts are a screen, and somehow the distance between a screen and the viewer is collapsed, where we just are the screen where these things are playing. So why would we then think that in addition to processing the information, projecting on a screen, there's also a viewer, an understander, something else that mysteriously plays a role in all of this?
Yeah, I've got a question. Do you guys want to respond to that, or do you want to hold off on that and give your own
I was trying to make Dennett's view seem plausible. So the reason that we think that there's not this extra thing called understanding, or this extra component in addition to processing information, is because this conception of a little guy who sits and watches all of these things is false. We just are the screen that processes the information. We are the screen where it displays, and there's nothing else in addition to the processes going on, which is thought. And that's one way to think your way into the plausibility of our equation.
You guys are welcome to just give an independent argument for Searle's view. And if people want me to respond, excellent argument.
I mean, I guess, my thoughts on that would be, I wouldn't disagree with you. I wouldn't say there is some extra person there observing these thoughts in my mind. I'm observing these thoughts in my mind. But with a computer program that's simply programmed to give various outputs for various inputs, I would say there's no screen really at all. There is no screen of information for anyone to watch, even if there was someone there to watch it. That would be, my thought on it, because it's simply taking inputs that a person, put into it and giving various outputs. But really, it's the person's inner, thoughts, inner screen, you could say, that's, if anything, exemplified.
I just want to add to that, a computer can't understand. So the human understanding, but you didn't define the computer's understanding, which is the main point of the article. Like a zombie or wait, what? I'm confused now. I'm sorry. Ignore me. Yeah. I don't know how to do it. Ignore me.
One thing I wanted to respond to was that you seem to be saying that there's a difference between understanding and the processes that take place. So like you can have processes going on in your brain, but it's not necessarily true that you're understanding it. Or processes or whatever the program. The program takes place and it's not necessarily understanding, is what you said.
In a computer?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. So if we take that, if we say that understanding, you're saying that understanding is totally separate from the programming. Couldn't we say that that is a category mistake? We say that they are not of the same category because we can say that programming is necessarily a part of understanding in the sense that in order to understand something, you need the programming, but you have more than that in order to understand it take place.
I mean, what are you? You're saying like, what are you on? Could you specify?
I'm saying you're saying that there's a distinction between understanding and processing by calling them by saying that they're of the same logical category. I'm saying that they're not of the same logical category. I'm saying that understanding is a different category than programming.
I mean, I wouldn't completely disagree with that. But I mean, so then how does that mean that a computer that's programmed to act like a human? How does that mean that that's grounds for judging that it has consciousness? Well, I'm saying, okay, you're saying, am I saying understanding is more than just, you know, a series of more than information processing, basically, you're saying. That understanding, I'm saying understanding is more than information processing. Yes, I am saying that. And you're saying that, well, the information processing isn't of the same logical type.
Yeah, it's more of the same thing as you're saying that I see the Chinese room. I see the Chinese room. I see that there's things going into it. I see there's things going out of it. I see that there's a program taking place. And I see that he's responding correctly to what I wanted to say. But you're saying, where's the understanding? Well, isn't understanding just everything that you just saw? Like the combination of all of it together, isn't that understanding?
No, I would say no. And I think the problem here is that there is a subjective nature of the mind. I mean, there just is. And I think, you know, what it sounds like almost like you're trying to do is just trying to fit it all into this, you know, neat, objective, you know, view of the mind. But I think that you can't disregard the subjective features of the mind in studying it, because by its very nature, the mind is subjective. So, I mean,
Can I ask a follow-up question? Could you use the inverted spectrum to support your point?
yes. Yes, so, for example, two different, I mean,
part of the essay question you guys are responsible for.
two different people, you know, two different people could potentially perceive the same color, the same reflection of electromagnetic energy in two different ways. So what we might agree that, okay, that the tree's green, but we might be seeing two different things because there's a subjective nature of consciousness there. That really, the only way to know what you're seeing is to be in your mind, to be you. And of course that's possible. So yeah, I mean, how would you explain that?
Well,
I just want to add on to that. Back in like Middle Ages, I didn't mention this before, but back in the Middle Ages, the sky was perceived as red and not blue. So.
but even in the case of the sky being red and not blue, they're looking at a physical object that is capable of having color. However, to say that two people see the same color differently isn't a coherent statement, because a color isn't a physical object that can itself be colored. It's not the type of thing that can have color, and therefore, again, we've reached this point where there's a category mistake in trying to use the inverted spectrum, because you cannot vocalize your point without making a category mistake.
Well, what if, I mean, both are here.
I actually relate to argue. The sky is not a physical object that light can bounce off. You know, there's the atmosphere, which does absorb light. However, the sky itself is a mere concept in our mind. The same as, say, the color blue. You know, if the sky, which is just an idea in our mind, can be the color blue, then why can't blue be blue?
Because the sky is a idea that is referring to something that is physical. The sky, when we say the sky, I mean, whether I know it or not, the molecules that are in the air. When I say the color green, I'm not referring to something physical, I'm referring to an abstract idea. When I say the sky, I am referring to that, whether I know it or not. I'm referring to something physical.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're right. I mean, you're right. The color green is in itself the color green. But the problem with it is you're almost, it's almost like I feel like you're shifting the focus. I'm not really talking specifically about, you know, the object or even the color green. I'm talking about the perceptual experience of seeing the color green. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, because there is something that it's like for you to see green. I mean, there is. And there's something that it's like for me to see green. So why, I mean, what's wrong with saying those two perceptual experiences are different?
I would assert that there is nothing that it is like to see the color green, that it's just a series of processes in our head that when they go together we call it green, but that doesn't mean that we are experiencing green externally of those processes.
I don't.
Think about it this way. Let's not talk about the inverted color spectrum, but the inverted sound spectrum. You hear high sounds and you hear low sounds. High sounds, high pitch, low sounds, low pitch. So can you invert that spectrum? And let's say low sounds sound high and high sounds sounds low. And how do you know what the subjective feel of another person's sound spectrum is like? But this just seems implausible. Because in the case of sound, like we know sound is a wave just as light is a wave. And in the case of sound, if you're listening to a high sound, you can almost hear the really high vibrations really fast. Like, but then a low one, you can only hear it. And so it just is tied to the physical nature of the process. And the subjective feel just is that process. And there's nothing apart from the really high up and down wave or the really low wave. In addition to that scientific process, there's also the subjective feel of that. And so why would that be any different for color? I mean, if it's just a light wave, maybe there's just the direct physical process, and that's what it is.
So let's not, let's try and make it more focused on like the music stuff. There's an 8 spectrum octave, right? So there's like a C to C. So for a tone deaf person, they might hear C as something else. So it's still possible that like their perceptions of the sound is different from what you perceive it. It's just that we call it tone deaf because the majority says that no, that's wrong. But they could be right in their heads.
Well, and like you even said, I mean, I agree that perceptual experience and the physical, you know, color of an object or what light wave it happens to bounce off of itself are two different. You're right. They're two different logical types. I mean, but I don't think that is reason against the notion of the inverted spectrum. I mean, just because it's of a different logical type, and just because, yes, there are processes that happen in the brain that lead to that experience, you know, they create that experience, and let's say we call that experience all those processes, but then we're also calling that experience the subjective experience for the person. I mean, they are two different logical types, but they're both equally as real. I mean,
I'll hold that debate for a second on Andrew's point. When you think of a tone deaf person, we know what we call a tone deaf person is someone who has a behavioral difference when it comes to music. and they can't see. But this doesn't say anything about their perceptual experience, what it's like to hear the note C. It's just when they try to sing the note C, they do a bad job of it. So it is tied to behavioral motion. And even with those people, if you're tone deaf, you can still tell a higher sound versus a lower sound. You might not be able to say, oh, that's a C, that's a D, but you can tell the difference between these two, and their spectrum isn't inverted, and there is a behavioral manifestation. And so, as Dennett were claiming, so why are you invoking something in addition to this behavioral manifestation? That's what it's like, which explains this. Because it just seems behavior does explain it. You don't need to.
Well, I was just gonna say that like in depth spectrum may not be inverted, but maybe shifted. So they're not being able to sing out the note C may just be like a manifestation of like they are hearing the note as something different. Because you won't actually know if they're hearing it different from how other people are hearing it. It could just be the way that they hear it, so they just sing it out.
I mean, here I would just want to go to empirical psychology and say, imagine like the 16-hertz Hertz note. There you can actually hear the waves in real time. You can have someone tap out when they hear the doo, 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 doo. And you can do tone deaf people versus people with perfect pitch. And if they can actually tap out when the rhythm happens, whether or not they can sing the note, then that would be a behavioral manifestation where we can test whether or not it's going on.
Is it Aaron? I'm sorry. Yes, he's Aaron. I'm sorry. Paul. Yes, I got that as I asked. To respond to Paul's point, I would say that you need to coherently state what the inverted spectrum is before we can even think about it, because until we can understand even the question, how can we begin to think about what an answer to the question is? So we're not speaking about anything if we're trying to talk about this inverted spectrum. You're saying that we perceive green differently. I don't know what that means.
Sorry, I'm a little confused. What does it have to do with just people see and think?
You want me to, I just want me to clarify this just a little. So what's at stake here is Dennett claims that once you know the physical, publicly observable facts about the machine, there's nothing left to discover. There's no further discovery to make. Searle denies that. Searle says you can know all the facts about how things process information, but there's this further fact to know. What's going on inside of their mind? And do they have intentionality? But what Paul has done is he suggested, well, let's set aside the question of whether machines have intentionality. Just, you can know all the physical facts about knowing what's going on in my brain, but you don't necessarily know how the color green seems to me. Maybe it seems different to me than it does to you. And if Paul can get them to grant that, then that means that in addition to knowing all the physical public facts, there are further facts to know. And that tends to support Searle's view. So they are denying that. They're saying, no, once you know all the behavioral facts, there's nothing further to know. So for example, Angeline pointed out a tone-deaf person and to show that our perceptions of tones could differ. But then Nick said, well, wait a second, but there's a behavioral difference there. What we need, Nick would say, is a case where two people perceive things differently, but their behavior is the same and their physical facts are all the same. And then what Connor has been saying is, and you haven't done that yet. You've got to coherently describe it. So that's, and then as I understand it, the burden is now on Searle's side, which, by the way, I'm happy to jump in at any time, to say, here's how to describe it, or something along those lines. And you could use Nagel at this point. I mean, you don't even necessarily have to coherently, account for the inverted spectrum. You can just talk about Nagel, maybe. Or,
yeah, I mean, that was like my next thought. Okay, so let's say you can't coherently describe it. Oh, okay. But for example, bats. Bats, see with sonar, which is a different way of perceiving the world, completely different from us. Yet most people would probably grant that they have conscious experience, that there is something that it's like to be a bat. So, I mean, there clearly is this subjective characteristic of consciousness, and trying to ignore that just because you can't think of a way to coherently describe its interaction with the physical at this point, to just ignore it totally, ignore a glaring, obvious truth that there is something that it's like to be a bat, is ignoring an important truth, and you know, it's something that needs to be considered.
So, your side has claimed that philosophical zombies can exist. So there, or potentially, there might be an organism that acts like it's human or is conscious and has perceptual experience, but it can't think. So let's imagine a zombie bat. A bat that uses sonar and behaves like a bat that uses sonar, but there is nothing that it's like to be that bat, because it's a zombie bat, which is something that you should be able to claim. Let's even imagine that, you know, within bat species, one species there is something like it, one species there's not. Can you tell them apart? No. In fact, for all we know, bats as a whole might have evolved without that. And you can imagine maybe like insects or amoebas, there's nothing less like, and then a continuum of more and more complex planes all the way up to bats. And you say when you get to a bat, there's something that's like, but why should you think that? Especially if zombies are possible, there might be nothing that it's like to be a bat, and you can't tell that based on anything. So you've asserted that there is something that it's like, but by your own lights, you can't tell that. That's an ad hoc assertion that you know for bats that this is the case. So that seems like a non sequitur.
I just want to bring up the fact that there are zombie ants. There's like a zombie. So there is something that is like to be a zombie.
Something that's like to be what?
Does that want to make either one up there, or we can also take, maybe now would be a good time to open it up to everyone in the room. Does anyone want to, sorry. Okay, sure, we can do that. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, we'll hold this in abeyance right now. You guys want to go to the Chinese room? Okay, do you guys have, AJ? Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that behavior is the only thing that determines whether or not something understands, correct?
There's nothing in addition to behavior called understanding.
Okay. Then I'll say you have a machine with no real computer components. Just say a wooden board on a sled with different sized holes in it that you put different sized balls on the ground, and so it's balls by size. Would you say that that machine has an understanding of size because it is able to separate these balls by size as well as any computer or human could do if they were programmed to do so?
We wouldn't need to say that.
Yep. What would this machine have different from, say something, what does this machine have different from, say, a computer or a human that is able to do the same thing? Scale that up in complexity. You're saying that there is nothing beyond behavior, yet behavior doesn't necessarily explain, whether or not you understand. You say there's nothing more to life than understanding.
Yeah.
Or there's nothing more that is understanding. So, yeah.
I mean, I think we would just say that, do you have some kind of reason for thinking that a human understands size better than this board? If so, what is it? What kind of answer could you give? Could you say, well, humans can describe different types of shape or sizes, or they can think about different types of sizes, or they can, compare them, or, would your answer be something that humans can do that this board can't do? If so, then you've given a behavioral answer, which is what we're arguing for. But the challenge would be, can you show something that makes you think humans understand size that's completely devoid from any possible action the human could perform?
Right.
I don't think That's actually my point. You mentioned earlier that you say that we have no idea if there's anything like to be a bat. You know, we just kind of assume that it is. My argument, right, yes, but you then said, you know, we don't know. You said, in response to their argument, that we don't know if there's something like to be that bat. In other words, I don't know if there's something like to be you.
Exactly.
But I know there's something like to be me, because I know there's something like to be me. And it's not something that can be explained in physical terms, like the color green. The color green is not the wavelength green hitting our eye, especially considering we only see 3 different colors. One might be green, but you know we only respond to 3 different wavelengths. Okay, you know.
3 different dimensions to, we're trichromates.
Yeah. But you know, so generally speaking, we only respond, we're blending 3 different colors together. We're not, or we're blending an understanding of these 3 different wavelengths into what we call color, which is not the wavelength hitting our eye. It's a long series of interpretations from that wavelength to this understanding green, which isn't a physical understanding whatsoever.
Right, but you've just said, you said it's a process and we respond accordingly to this process. And you're just sounding like a behaviorist. I mean, I don't see what else you're saying that we're doing in addition to these processes and behaviors.
One thing you did say, you said that they can't know that you have consciousness and you can't know that they have consciousness. That doesn't sound like a behaviorist. So that was...
What I was going to say is the process that he described, where we interpret, and then everything, and then there's something else which is non-physical. I think you said, which is the understanding. That sounds basically Cartesian dualism is what it sounds like you're saying there. In which case, I would have to challenge you to give me a neurological. If we can describe the human brain neurologically, which it seems like we can, give me some evidence for a non-physical mind.
If it's non-physical, then why should we look for a physical answer?
If we have a physical answer, why should we look for a non-physical answer?
Because the physical does not give us the answer.
Tell me why it doesn't give us the answer.
Well, I can just, what's the question? Because the question is there, but I want you to make it so we all follow. What is the question?
The question is whether or not the physical is what purely determines our understanding. Our understanding.
That's right. Can I just put it a little bit more?
Yeah.
Am I conscious? Are you conscious? Is the bat conscious? These are the questions. And then you guys would need to say, is this, I think you're going to say, give me all the physical facts and I know the answer to that. But the Searle will say, no, give me all the physical facts and I still don't know whether the bat's conscious. There's this further thing I need to discover. So just clarifying the debate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I guess, well, I was going to try to go back to the Chinese room a little bit, just try to bring up some points, because, I think we've been talking a lot about kind of, is there a subjective nature of consciousness, or is it just physical? And, which is definitely important to the question. But, in the situation in the Chinese room, I mean, the man clearly, well, the room as a whole, with his friends in it, we'll do it that way, clearly understands Chinese. I mean, clearly appears to understand Chinese to a native speaker. The room's able to give instant responses. It would seem like they're just another native Chinese speaker, but the whole time, all the room's doing is manipulating symbols. The symbols have no meaning to them, to the room of people. For example, like a native speaker could say, oh, isn't that a cute dog over there? And the person might be programmed, and even though that's kind of, well, here, I'll give, oh, that wall is, what color is that wall? And the person might be programmed to say, oh, well, it's brown, or, but I mean, that's, you can't even really give it that way because the person would have to see the wall to be able to give a color. So that, I mean, but that even shows, you know, they're going to be programmed to say the same thing each time, which shows there's really no meaning to what they're saying. You know, they could say, "Oh, I love this dog," but they're not talking about a dog. They're just manipulating symbols. So, I mean, how would you guys respond to that? Directly, right? What, I mean, are you asserting that there is meaning to that symbol manipulation?
So you just said it's possible to ask the question that they would keep giving the same answer to, and you'd be able to tell that they didn't understand.
Well, you could ask a question like, what is your name? And they might be trained to respond. They might manipulate the symbols to respond that like, my name is John, even though their name is not John. Their name is like Dean or something.
Well, the easy response to that is that if you can ask a question like that, then it does not pass the Turing test. We would say that in that analogy it does not pass the Turing test, so you would have to say no, it does not have consciousness because it didn't act like that's consciousness.
I mean, and yes, that's true. Okay, so let's say that, you know, they are able to give correct answers. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. Well, I was just saying, let's say they are able to give correct answers to all these questions. They're still just manipulating symbols. They're still not conscious of even they're not aware of what they're saying. What they're saying is not about anything. It's just the process of symbol manipulation. It's not about anything. So maybe they can answer, oh, yes, that wall is dark blue, brownish, you know. But maybe they can give the right answer. But they're just manipulating symbols. They're not actually giving an answer.
They're not understanding.
They're not actually understanding the answer. Sorry.
But what more is there to understanding than the manipulating of those symbols and giving the correct output? I don't know what you're talking about. There is nothing that is understanding and not physical processing, physical processes.
But understanding has to have some aboutness to it. What are you understanding? I mean, I think you could probably agree that, you know, for someone to understand something, they have to understand something. There has to be an object of their understanding. Whereas in that example, there's really there's nothing that they're understanding. There's no object. You know, it's not about anything.
Understanding is something for the individuals, but none of the individuals understand. But it appears that the group itself understands. But that doesn't make sense.
Could we say the same thing for a rate? If we say that we sped up the Chinese room like Paul mentioned earlier, if we put hundreds of thousands of people in there so that you can respond almost instantaneously with the program, couldn't we say that each one of those members acts almost like a neuron? If we say that the neurons in your brain are firing, they're understanding, they're going through their connections, would we say that each neuron in the brain understands itself what it is doing, or is it just the connections which themselves connect to the understanding? So if we say that every single part does what it needs to, and then because the whole entire part comes together as a whole, that's the understanding. It's not necessarily that every single neuron has to understand the entire thing. It just has to understand what it's doing.
Sorry, I just want to go back. You mentioned just now that it wouldn't pass the Turing test, right? He didn't give the right responses to the.
Yeah, we changed it.
No, I just want to respond to that.
Okay, go ahead.
So if the speaker is less than fluent, does that mean he doesn't understand, does that mean he understands at all? Because he's not. Just because he doesn't pass the Turing test doesn't mean that he may or may not understand.
Can you say that again?
Okay, so let's say the guy coming out of the room is not the guy coming out of the room, just a random person, someone who learned Chinese, Mandarin. You guys are fluent. Okay, so a person who just learned how to speak Mandarin is less than fluent, and then like if you give a response, like if you ask him a question, he may not give the right response. Does that mean he does understand? Does that mean he doesn't understand? He doesn't pass the Turing test. Does that mean he's not an intelligent speaker? He's still a person.
So you're saying that not all humans are
You're saying not all humans who pass the Turing test can be in Chinese.
Not just in China.
But there's
Generally, not all humans can pass the Turing test.
Well, I mean, that seems a little implausible. If we, I mean, to not pass the Turing test, you wouldn't be able to believe that this person's a human. You know, if asked, is this a person, a human or machine, you want to say machine. And so, I don't think there's anyone that I've ever met who, if you asked me, you know, do you think they're human or do you think they're a machine, where I would say, they're a machine. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that they're actual human. I mean, I think it's just part of.
Assuming you, sorry, you can go on. Oh, assume that like you're not talking to this person face to face. You're talking to them like over Skype or something. So they're responding in ways that like may seem a little crazy. Like they may be mentally disturbed. They may not be as highly educated as you are. So they're just responding in strange ways. So does that mean they're less human?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily mean that's just some objections against the test that was using. Each person say it was just to be a better test. They couldn't see which one was the way.
If I may just support Angeline's point, if Dennett's view, his thought is as thought does, and basically your mind is what you do. Well, what about someone who has intentionality, but isn't much capable of doing what is necessary to prove their intentionality? But well said, a good argument.
I would question that. I mean, because why would we think they have, like, you know, if I've got a 5-year-old and I ask them about some kind of abstract mathematics and they can't seem to articulate it or do it well, why would I think they have intentionality about that? I mean, there are cases where there are people who we think don't understand things and people who think we do understand things and we can discriminate that normally and think people don't have intentionality about certain things and we do have about other things. And, it's always been a behavioral test. I never get inside the mind enough to figure that out.
So you're saying that a Turing test may not necessarily prove intelligence?
Well, the reason we invoke the Turing test is because we say if something passes the Turing test, then it has whatever, some kind of mental life, somewhat similar to and the Chinese room is supposed to show, here's an example of something that passes the Turing test that doesn't have that kind of mental life. So now you're going with a different objection saying, yeah, but the Turing test didn't even matter in the first place. And then, you know, you can give someone who wouldn't pass the Turing test who has some kind of mental life. But, you know, then we can just give a revised, okay, not convincing that you're a human on face, but, you know, just some kind of behavioral test. And we use those all the time to distinguish people who, we can tell some people have mental handicaps, some people don't, some people are good at math, some people aren't. And we just, based on their behavior, we figure those things out in ordinary life.
What if the handicap is physical as opposed to mental? Like if you ask someone to jump, but their legs don't work, and so they understand that you're asking them what to do, but they can't react to it.
Could they speak and tell that they understand?
Say they can.
Okay, so
you have no way of knowing if they understand or not, based on their behavior.
and is there any other kind of empirical test? Can I scan the brain or?
Like if you're saying that you can only know if they're conscious based on behavior.
Right, well, let's take, I'll ask someone about jumping and take a huge study and ask everyone about jumping and see what kind of neurons light up when they think about jumping. And now put that person in the same machine and see how their brain behaves when I talk about jumping. Do the same areas light up? If nothing lights up, or if the areas that light up when they're asleep, when other people are asleep, light up, then I'll think, well, they're probably not thinking about that. And that's how we would tell if someone's in a coma or not, you know, or how's their brain behaving.
Your question is a good one. I actually asked Dennett that when I was a student of his. And I can tell you how he replied. What he said was, we have to consider a counterfactual situation in which the person had their whatever disabilities removed, and ask, given their actual brain, how would they manipulate their body? Something along those lines is what he suggested, which is similar. Other?
What if you couldn't tell at all?
Shall we open it up to the floor? who haven't spoken yet want to contribute to the debate? Micah and then Tien.
Is there a way that you can make a machine not to do anything but to think, just to think? Doesn't give any output, doesn't receive any input, but just make a machine to say, picture the Eiffel Tower. There's because from what I understand, you guys are basing the idea of understanding off of behavior. So what if you make a machine that doesn't behave? Then can it think?
Based off of said, I think that we can say that we took a human being, we said think about the Eiffel Tower, and we mapped their brain hundreds of thousands of times so that we knew what it looked like when people thought about the Eiffel Tower. I think it is conceivable that we could build a computer that reproduced those mental processes in the brain when somebody thought about the Eiffel Tower. So, to answer your question, yes.
Okay. Let's say that you could actually reproduce, something. It could at least process that information. Are you saying that then the computer would be actually thinking about it? That it would be having a conscious thought? Like, okay. Well, I mean, if you did that, then I would say, well, clearly you created something identical to a brain. Because, at least at this point, I don't know with computer programming that's really supposed to be based on. So, can you program a computer with no input and output?
If I could just restate Paul's response to Dan. So, what Dan, or then just, Dan said, here's how you create a computer that thinks about the Eiffel Tower. Take the human brain, clone it. Just figure out what the relevant processes are in the brain, clone it. The brain does it, so that presumably the computer will as well. I'm not sure exactly what that means in details, but surely that will work. And then Paul responded, well, now wait a second. If all that matters is what program you're running and not your hardware, like how do you know what to clone? I mean, yeah, you could clone the human brain, sure, but surely you don't need a human brain to think about the Eiffel Tower. If the brain is just sitting there and not really, I mean, what is it that's relevant to the process that makes it be about the Eiffel Tower that you have to keep the same, and what is it you need to make different? Is that roughly your question? And Mike has his hand up. I don't know if you guys want to go, or Mike and I have a response. I mean, not Mike, I'm sorry, DJ.
Just real quick. Along the same lines, it's this. If a human is basically comatose, or I don't know what that term would be, but basically they can't move their body, but they still have brain activity, and say, for some reason they aren't receiving any sort of inputs like audio or touch or anything like that. Say they have none of that, yet they still have brain activity. Can you know what they're thinking?
I guess it would depend on what kind of science you have. If we can pin down the science enough that we can figure out what these areas light up in a specific pattern that people say they're thinking about this, then presumably we would know that if that person weren't in a coma and we asked them what they were thinking about, they would say, this is the thing we found in every other empirical study. And that's similar to how I respond to the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, I think it's making a distinction between what we can't do and what it is impossible to do. Like we're not saying that we can do all of these things like right now. Like some obviously some weird like you can't do this right now. Well, obviously we can, but we're saying that it would theoretically be possible with the right science to be able to do it.
But what I would say is, we're not saying that when you go in and you find the scientific data that, they're thinking about the Eiffel Tower, you're not saying they're thinking about the Eiffel Tower. You're saying that neurons are lighting up that would probably indicate that it's thinking about the Eiffel Tower. You can't be sure. Just say.
I feel bad because I cut Tien off. Ken, did you want us to have some time for you? We've got about 8 minutes left.
I'll just go back to the Chinese room first. You said that the man in the Chinese room, by answering every question possible that he might have, then that means he understands. He passed the person and he understands Chinese, right? But I could prove that he's not cannot understand Chinese. Assume that there's a message sent into him that says in Chinese, the room is on fire. I can see it from outside. Maybe you cannot see it. Get out now. He get the message. Okay. He simulates the same Chinese symbol. He's like, okay, really? I'll get out now. Send the message. But he still stay inside the room and die.
Good example, man.
Someone will respond for that. It can be either people up here or in the audience. That's against Searle?
That was showing that the Chinese does not pass the Turing test.
Right. So you
Okay.
think,
Sorry. Someone will respond with you guys. Sorry, I'm sick.
Well, like I said, Turing test isn't exactly the best test for intelligence. So it has like a whole bunch of philosophical things wrong with it that are just oh my gosh, I can't enunciate properly. It has like, it's wrong on a philosophical level. And even if you face empirical issues, it's just a person can't pass a Turing test and still have consciousness. So it's just doesn't test the intentionality. It may test for intelligence, but definitely not intentionality.
I think our position is, science describes the way things behave, what happens when people are conscious, when we believe science. And then you philosophers are thinking that there's some extra fuzzy thing in addition to all these behavioral processes called consciousness. And it plays no explanatory role, it doesn't do anything. You can take it out of the equation and we still behave normal and still think we're conscious. But you say there's something else. And we're like, what? What is this extra thing? Can you show us an example where we would need to invoke this? And you say the Chinese room, here's something that behaves like it's human, but it has this fuzzy extra thing that you need to invoke. And we're skeptical of that. And so we're going to try to show that, that won't work. The Chinese room doesn't behave like it's human. It's not describable in the same way that humans would be. And so if you're granting in this case, fine, the Chinese room doesn't behave like that, behavioral test doesn't matter, well then what does matter? How can you motivate this extra fuzzy thing that you think exists when we don't see any motivation for it anywhere?
Well, on Searle's side, it could be here or in the audience.
Again, you're asking us to provide some sort of physical explanation for something that is non-physical, and we really have no idea what it is other than it simply exists. That's about the only thing we know.
I'm asking you for a scientific explanation. There are plenty of non-physical things that science can describe, like the ERP paradox in quantum mechanics. Not to explain what that is, but just there's non-local, non-physical kind of messages that somehow communicate between things, or just how somehow gravity can be between two objects in Newtonian physics. Gravity isn't itself a physical particle. It's non-physical, but describable by science. So maybe it's physical, maybe it's not physical, whatever. But can you give a scientific explanation? Or just any kind of explanation?
I think what AJ is suggesting is it's what needs to be explained is the difference between having consciousness and not having consciousness. What's the difference between a zombie bat and a regular bat? And it does seem to be the case that we can look at, say, a bat and know all the physical facts about the bat, and yet not know, is it a zombie bat or does it have consciousness? And no matter how much scientific knowledge we get, it seems that nevertheless there's still this important open question. And what you guys are doing is closing off a question that we think is open, namely, does it have consciousness? Is it human? And it's just a physical answer to that ontological question, or this question of what it is to be human, just seems like it's not satisfying to us. I mean, that's, I'm sort of building on what you were saying. Okay, so 2 minutes left in the debate.
I mean, I don't want to dominate here, but I would just, this seemed like an incoherent question then. If you keep saying, you can't tell the difference, there's nothing, it acts like that, and it's not conscious, and it just seems like this is an incoherent question here. If you can't draw any kind of distinction, there's no principled way, there's nothing well defined here, then it just doesn't seem like there is a difference. And I'm open to the question being answered, just give me some kind of answer, give me some kind of explanation.
I have not, if I may, or I mean, do you guys want to? I'm happy to sort of jump in because I want you guys have done an outstanding job of defending Dennett, so I sort of feel I want to.
The Dennettians have been killing it tonight.
The question is coherent even if the answer can't be asked. So the question, is it human or is it not, is well defined. And here's not a definition, but a way to tell that it's real. If it has consciousness and understanding, don't kill it. Or at least it's a moral issue. I mean, even if you can kill it, like you can kill maybe a cow or something, okay, but don't torture it. Whereas if it's an inanimate object, there's no issue of torture. You can't torture an inanimate object. Now this question, is it okay? Do I need to treat this thing ethically? That is a real question. It's an important question. The answer to it, I have no idea. I fully confess, I have no idea how to answer it. But I know it's a real question. And that's all I need to show in order to say that, well, I'm not happy with the answer you guys have given. Sure.
So imagine we end up believing Searle and create these kind of machines that just process information but aren't conscious. And we can create these automatons that act like they're human, but not thinking. We figure out how to create a bunch of zombies. And then society realizes we've solved all of our ills. We don't need prostitutes anymore. We can use female automatons. We don't need slaves anymore. We can use these automatons. We don't need these gladiators. We can just make them kill each other.
Right.
We sadomasochists can just torture these automatons all they want.
Right.
And so we eliminate crime and disease, or not disease, but disease, and then we can test them, infect them with Ebola, and see what happens.
Right.
And
you can make them biologically based and make them reproduce.
And solve sex trafficking because now we're just oppressing the automaton.
Right.
But these automatons act like the human, so they're screaming, "Don't do this to me! This hurts! This is painful! Please don't torture me!" We say, "Well, Searle's right. You don't." And are we really going to continue to let them suffer, and they're going to try to, of course, counsel one another, and we're going to say, no, they don't have any rights, they can't think. Are we really going to draw that principal distinction? It seems if I lived in this world, I would say, these people, how can you tell if they can't think? What are you doing? Why are you oppressing them? This is a human rights violation.
Two things. I want to say the first thing is that you don't actually know they're suffering because they're automatons. So you don't know if they're suffering or they actually have feelings. Second thing is you can program them not to say these things because they're automatons. So you just solve them.
But that's his point.
Yeah.
How do you know they're automatons?
Yeah. So.
And the masochist would be satisfied either.
I hate to say this. It's now 6 o'clock. We can keep going, but those of you who want to leave are excused. And thank you very much for participating in philosophy.
Well done, almost would have believed
These guys are tough to go against. I wouldn't want to go against.
I know. I was like, I think the most interesting is he's like, I'm not gonna say that. Yeah, so much for not saying anything.
Yeah.
There's still the knowledge that it is arguable. There is some evidence of life.
all they have to do is deny that what it is like to be such a creature has no behavioral consequence. And after all, why do we think that there is something that has something? Because of the behavioral consequence. Because of
Also because we know our own context.
No. It's by analogy with our own experience. that contribute
like
to
pluck a leg off it, doesn't want
consciousness
like
measures or something that is like, why do you do that?
Yeah.
So it's still the behavioral results.
Usually if you start using
There's
hand code,
like nothing that like
these kind of
intentions that determine the trust of the limbic system, where there's something
Yeah, but
like
it's
the
still,
impact.
it's still generally.
Their behavioral
Yeah.
outputs, given the right kind of stimuli, are sufficient complexity and so forth that it looks like there's some kind of a basic primitive emotional life.
Well, what about, yeah, I was thinking you guys should have, like, for me, your best argument was definitely the bad argument, like, it was hard.
Oh, yeah,
That
the
was
bad
like,
argument is the reason
I like
that
that.
people had to go to a limited material in order to save.
Yeah, like that's like what we were basically trying to say, like in response to Jamie, agent went like really good about like there is something there, and we're like, well, like you can't basically you can't describe something that's immaterial with, but like you can't describe something that's not physical, it's just physical terms.
I know.
And
Well,
like
I
we're saying
have
that
like
there's
a bunch of
I
extra
don't
stuff.
care whether it's physical or not. If you think the mind matters to what we do, don't tell me it has no behavioral output. It does. And so it does make an observable behavioral difference. Otherwise, the soul would not matter to Rob. It does only because it does cause you to bear.
So then we have to, like, our point, like, what I was trying to say is, you gotta say, like, give me an example of something that you need to invoke that, basically, you need to invoke something more than.
I mean, as soon as they try to invoke something that has no behavioral difference.
It falls apart.
It at least indicates.
Well, then why appeal to its presence at all?
Yeah, so I mean, you already explained it, like, why.
So here's where I think the better argument for a dualist interpretation has nothing to do with any of these questions that you deal with souls or any of that.
Truly, of course.
Okay? There's no Dennett worth a dime
This
ever
subjective consciousness, this, first person perspective.
Suppose
How does
you've
it
got
affect what you do? Can it be coherently
some
described in
mechanical
English?
system, not just
No,
what a robot.
probably not.
So it's behavior.
Probably could give a behavioral
It
that
fails the
you know,
Turing
something
test.
as complex as a human,
Right?
and even maybe a machine.
And so it fails just the empirical
machine
test
is very much like the cabinet for intelligence.
Yeah.
I think the where you really want to put this,
And you keep tweaking this machine.
Dennett would say, yes, we can't
And it
tell
keeps
whether.
coming closer to
Dennett
that.
would say we're all null.
Right? And you keep making further. You just add a couple more lines to
There's
the
nothing that like.
and then almost passes, but still.
And that just seems really impossible.
I know.
You could bring that out,
And you're right.
force me to.
One
I know, I know.
more subroutine.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Almost had
10 more
but he
lines.
said, there's nothing, I don't know what's
Now
happening to
it
you.
passes that last.
Yeah, exactly. But I know there's something that's.
So you've gone
And I would say, no,
from
you
total
totally
lack of understanding, lack of intelligence, to presence of intelligence.
And that was
the
the 10 lines of code.
I can do that in one line.
Guys, well done, I really enjoyed that argument. Now,
Yeah.
So you
hopefully,
can sort of give a
let's
spectrum
pray
argument
that
there on, right? Passing the Turing test really is, right? The market. Well,
But you don't agree with Searle, though, like, you can use that argument against Searle, because you're like, well, the brain is the mind. It's like, well,
no,
what if
no,
you
I
replace
don't think Searle's argument.
I loved Searle's analogy, I hated where he went with it.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I love.
Searle got his butt handed to him by the church once with a version of the systems reply.
Yeah, I mean, that's
right, where
That's what
the
I was.
systems reply. What was his response? Oh, you need the right kind of stuff. You can't have just something that's in all of its features analogous to neurological information processing, to right synaptic pathways getting the red electrochemical. It's got to be that specific kind of physical stuff. Who the hell are you to say that? That's an empirical question. That's a medical scientific question. You're sitting in your armchair, you're going to tell me that it has to be neurons? You don't know whether or not there's some little green men off in orbit off of Alpha Centauri who might do it without neurons. And that's what the church ones came at him with. And they rubbed him. I mean, he got stomped. He is abandoned that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I loved the analogy, like, I loved his analogy.
A lot of
I felt this analogy was like really, I think it might
You
ultimately.
get all your input out correlations,
Yeah.
but if you're, all you're looking at is input out correlation, you're not looking at the intelligence.
But then he goes to.
But then, try to prove that, the Chinese really are a whole lot harder to get. Whereas I think that argument
I loved it.
does it quite well.
I felt that they should have hammered the bad argument more. That's what I was afraid they were gonna do, so I was like, I'm not sure how to respond if they just hammer the bad argument.
Right. Because Because there you actually could turn to something along the lines of, no, there's no behavioral difference necessarily, but I know that there is a difference. Not in the fact.
Me. Like, gotcha,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Like that's
There.
like when he responded to the zombie back then, like that's where I would have that would have been my response. Like you said. Like if an alien was looking at me and they knew everything about me,
They wouldn't know that I
they
was not
would
alone.
yeah,
Damn it, I
but I'm
know.
not. Like but I'm still not.
Right,
Like
right, right.
I know that. Like that's how I would
My
respond.
experience with pain are real pain.
Like, that's how I would
That's right.
respond to that.
That's right.
And if they had just hammered that, I don't know like how they could. I thought who was that guy's name? Yeah,
You just have to bite the bullet. There is nothing that it is like to be me. There's nothing that it feels like. There's no such there's no such category as quality.
Hold on. And here's the thing. I think that
And then it's
it might be
consistent.
possible
You can't
for
refute.
a scientific process to maybe prove understanding exists in some way or another, in some way or shape.
If you ever come up with such a scientific process, then it's a successful generation of such, of anything, that satisfies that process. Qualifies as understanding.
No, I just
And we can program anything we want.
like the zombie bat.
However, I believe it's beyond our understanding.
What's the other understanding?
But I would encourage you guys to
Understanding
become
itself,
really
basically.
You mean we don't know what understanding is?
We know it is, but like
We don't know how
how it happens.
possibly generated? Well, that's an engineering question. So what? We don't presently know how it is made to occur. So what? Big deal. That's just an engineering question. Bioengineering just has to be a whole lot more sophisticated. And once we have
But it
perfected
can't
neuroscience, we can do it.
You can't get perfect. One I don't believe in
Now you're
perfection.
just back to the question. Why would you suppose I think perfected neuroscience? Because you're assuming the presence of a soul. Noted that he worked 2 times.
It's not associated. It has to do with the way that humans start. It's actually completely separate.
Oh, okay, no one human is getting that. I don't see why you couldn't
That's
have
the one that
perfected
like,
neuroscience.
that basically.
Anyway, not part of the point I'm really arguing. I'm saying it's still beyond our understanding in the way that the way electrons work.
Participating, going up against the virus.
That's
not true. No. You may say good points, and then I
observe
articulate your good points just to make sure that
down at
everyone.
the electron level, we start to find that our mere observations change things up. So basically, trying to go
It was
too
necessary for us to push back. You guys were doing really well. So I felt there was imbalance in the force. I would not have those guys.
When you get your sign for results definition for energy state, that's because the thing really does happen. And a host of energy states, not just one.
Yeah, well that's something that we're just like you just had
I'm talking about the
No, absolutely, you're defending Dennett's view, and
What are you
that's
talking
right.
about?
Yeah.
Milton Gaither didn't believe
Okay, so
everything
you
he
can
was
do
saying,
it
he was
out.
defending private.
And what happens when you
I believe
do the
most of what I
measurement
was
to get
saying
the
when I
waveform?
defended Russell, but that's
People
just
aren't
like
even
Russell.
needed. We're irrelevant. When you do the measurement, you get the waveform.
Well, I've got family
And it
meetings, so
occupies definite
goodbye, thank you very much, I
standard
appreciate it.
range of energy states.
no, I'm talking about
No, next week.
a
Oh, yeah.
test
Oh, what about it?
it's unobservable.
No. What I'll tell you is that it really is both part of life.
What does that mean?
You have to stop thinking.
I was thinking that your privacy is a big thing. Like you start together, we can talk about.
So what do we? That's
They've
the
gone to
thing.
cloud.
Two numbers, what you can call it.
Okay.
A smear
But
of a certain
do we
sort of
know
segment.
that cloud is really what it is? That cloud is
I'm
just
pretty good at it.
yeah. Okay, but that cloud
I don't
is just
see any
mere.
reason why, I mean, I don't see any non-question begging reason why you would suppose that a perfected science is impossible.
no there it is.
Do you think that a perfected chemistry is impossible, or that a perfected just macrobiology is impossible? If not, why in the world would a perfected neuroscience be impossible? It's just this sucker inside my cranium. It's doing stuff that follows the laws of biology. There are no non-deterministic, non-mechanistic laws of biology. I don't see what the big screen deal with it.
You're straight up dualist.
I'm hard.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
But if the people you disagree with, that's
Yeah.
understand the people you disagree with
From
before.
From everything you said in class.
Right.
From everything you said. Although if
you're gonna ever successfully refute anything, you must get your head properly inside of there.
I suppose if you're a Christian though, don't you have to accept some form of dualism on some level?
I think so.
Yeah.
But no, Peter Van Inwagen is not.
But
As
no,
far as
okay.
Peter Van Inwagen is concerned, we are animated sacks of meat. That will be physically resurrected after the second coming, because he believes, as I do not, in a physical second coming, physical bodies and a physical heaven, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm a Marxist, and I say that's a bunch of good.
I have to go right now.
He goes.
I'm giving a presentation on.
I know, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 134, right?
Nice to meet you.
Thanks. Do you have that? Like,
Yeah, I'm gonna turn it off.
okay. Would we be able to,
I set it on the lowest animation, so I can.
would we be able to record the talk that I'm giving?
What's that?
Would we be able to record the talk I'm giving?
Ooh, okay, what we would need to do is upload that to somewhere so that.
Well, 0 is 32.
No, I can just go to my house computer.
Okay, sure.
See you guys.
See you, Shank.
Let me go start.
Yes, sir.
Walk up to your office for you really quick.
Yeah, sure, man.